In the last lecture, we had a high-level overview of what route guards are in Angular and when do we use them. And one of the scenarios where we use a route guard is when we want to protect a route from unauthorized access. Now, to protect a route from unauthorized access, we can either use canActivate route guard or we can use canActivate child route guard. And we are going to talk about them in great detail in our coming lectures. But to understand this canActivate route guard and canActivate child route guard, first we need to implement a simple auth service in our Angular application, which we will use for authenticating and authorizing the user. And that's what we are going to do in this lecture. We are going to create a very simple auth service for authentication and authorization. Let's go to VS Code. And here we are back to our Angular routing project. In here, in the services folder, I have created a new service called user service. If I open this user service, you will notice that inside this user service class, we have a user array, and this array contains a list of users. Basically, here we have 4 users, and each user has an ID, a name, a username, and a password. So here I'm using this user model. If I go to this user model, for that, let's expand this models folder. Let's open this user.ts file. There you will notice that each user is going to have an ID, a name, a username, and password. And in this user class, I also have this constructor using which we can create a new user. And that's what we are doing here in the user service. We are using the constructor of this user class to create the users. So basically here we have 4 users. Now, only these 4 users are the member of our Angular application. So only these 4 users should be able to access the protected routes of our Angular application. And to authenticate and authorize these users, what we are going to do is we are going to create an auth service. So inside this services folder, let's go ahead and let's create a new file, and let's call this file auth service. Inside this file, let's go ahead and let's create a class and export it. And let's call this class auth service. Now, since it is a service class, I'm also going to decorate it with @injectable decorator. And in order to use this @injectable decorator, we need to import it from angular/go. And to this @injectable decorator, I'll pass a metadata object, and there I will specify the provided in property. And there I will set its value to root. So we want to provide this service from root, from app module. So here we have created our auth service class. Inside this auth service class, I'm going to have a property called isLogged. It is going to be of type Boolean, and initially I will set it to false. So initially when the page loads for the first time, all the users are logged out. Then I'm going to create a method. I'll call it login. So whenever the user will try to log into our Angular application, this method will be called. Okay. Inside this method, what we are going to do is we are going to check if a user with a given username and password exists or not. For that, for this login method, we are going to take the username and password as the parameter. Now inside this login method, let's go ahead and let's write the logic to log in the user. So basically what we want to check is if inside this users array, if we have a user with the username and password which we are going to receive for these parameters or not. If we have a user with this username and this password inside this users array, in that case, we will log in that user. Otherwise, we will show a message saying that the credentials you have entered is not correct. So how we are going to do that? First of all, in order to query this users array, we need to inject an instance of this user service class inside this auth service. For that, what I'll do is I'll create a property. I'll call it user service. It is going to be of type user service. Okay, and to ask Angular to inject an instance of this user service class inside this auth service, I'm going to use inject method. And to use this inject method, we also need to import it from angular/go. And to this inject method, we also need to pass the type. So the type here is going to be user service. All right, so in this way, inside this user service property, we will have an instance of this user service class. And using that instance, we can access this users array. So here let's say this dot user service dot users. So this users is an array. On this array, we are going to call this find method, and using this find method, we are going to find an element from this users array which has this username and this password. Now, how are we going to do that? Basically, this find method, it is going to loop over each element of this users array, and the callback function which we are going to pass to this find method, it is going to receive that element. So for each iteration, it is going to receive the current element. Let's simply call it as u. And here, let's say u dot username, if it is equal to this username, and u dot password, if it is equal to this password. In that case, this find method, it will return us that user. Let's go ahead and let's store it in a variable, and let's simply call it as user. Okay, let me move this end statement in a separate line so that it will be more readable. All right, so if this find method finds any user from this users array whose username matches the username value which we are going to receive for this username parameter, and whose password matches the password value which we are going to receive for this password parameter, in that case, this find method will return that user. Otherwise, if this find method does not find any such user with this given username and password, it will return undefined. So what we are going to do is, we are going to check if this user, if it is equal to undefined, that means no user with the given username and password exists. In that case, we are going to set this isLogged property, this property here, to false. But if the user is not undefined, that means there is a user which exists with this given username and password. In that case, we want to set this isLogged property to true. Okay, and finally, we also want to return that user. So let's simply say return user. So this is our login method. Now let's also go ahead and let's implement a logout method here. So when the user is trying to log out from the application, this logout method will be called. And there I'm simply going to set this isLogged property to false. As you can see, here we are creating a very simple auth service where we are setting the value of this isLogged property to true or false based on if the user is logged in or logged out. Finally, I'm also going to create another method. I'll call it is authenticated. And what this method is going to do is, it is simply going to return the value of isLogged property. So here I'll simply say return this dot isLogged. Okay, so this is our auth service. In this auth service, we have this isLogged property. If the isLogged property is true, that means the user is authenticated and is authorized. But if the value of this isLogged property is false, that means the user is not authenticated. The user is not logged in. Okay. Now we want to call this login method whenever in our application user clicks on this login link. So for that, first of all, what we want is when this login link is clicked, we want to show a login page. Let's go to VS Code. Let's go to routing module, and there let's create a new route. For that, we use a set of curly braces like this. There we specify the path. So the path here is going to be login, root URL slash login. And when this route is typed in the address bar, we want to show the view of login component. So to this component property, I'm going to assign login component. And in order to use this login component, we also need to import it from this file. So I have already created this login component in our Angular application. You can see that login component here. Okay. And if you save the changes, if you go to the web page, and if I type root URL slash login, and if I press enter, the login component looks something like this. All right. Now, when do we want to show this login page? Whenever this login link is clicked. And we have this login link in the header component. So let's go to header component.html. And if I scroll down, here we have this login link. On this login link, currently we are using href, but let's go ahead and let's use router link directive. And to this router link, let's assign /login. Okay, let's save the changes now. Let's go to the web page. Let's go to home page. And now when I click on this login link, it will take us to the login page. So now this is working. The next thing which we want to do is we are showing this login page, and in this login page, we have this username text box and we have this password text box. So what we want is once the user has entered the username and password, and once this login button is clicked, we want to verify whether a user with the given username and password exists or not. So this username, this password field and this button, it is present in the login component. Let's go to VS Code, and for now let me close this header component.html, and let's go to login component. So here we have this login folder. In there we have this login component.html. Here you can see we have this username input element, we have this password input element, and here we have our submit button. So now what I'm going to do is on this username input and on this password input, I'm going to add a template reference variable. On the username, I will add username template reference variable, and on the password input, I'll add password template reference variable. Okay, let's save the changes. And now let's go to login component.ts file. In there, I'm going to create two properties. The first property will be username. And what I want is inside this username property, I want to store this input element, a reference to this input element. For that, on this username, first of all, I'm going to use @viewChildDecorator. And to use this @viewChildDecorator, we also need to import it from Angular/Co. And to this @viewChildDecorator, we need to pass a parameter. Here, I'm going to pass this username template reference variable. All right. So in this way, this username, it is going to store a reference to this username input element. So here the type is going to be element ref. And again, in order to use this element ref, we need to import it from Angular/Co. In the same way, I'll also create another property. So I'll copy this line and I'll paste it here, and I'll call this property as password. And inside this password, I want to store a reference of this password input element. So on that, again, we are using this password template reference variable. So I'll copy this and I'll pass it to this viewChildDecorator. So in this way, inside this username and inside this password, we have a reference of username input element, and in here we have a reference of password input element. Now, here we have this submit button. Okay, so when this submit button is clicked, we want to check whether a user with a given username and password exists or not. For that, on this button, I'm going to bind click event. And when this button is clicked, I want to call a method on login clicked. Let's go ahead and let's create this method. And we need to create it inside this login component.ts file. Now, we know that this username, it is going to store a reference to username input element, and this password, it is going to store a reference to password input element. So from this username and password, we can get the value which the user has entered inside the username text box and password text box. So inside this method, what we are going to do is we are going to create two variables. First, I'll create this username variable. You can name this variable anything. And to get the username, we are going to use this username property. So here, let's say this dot username dot native element dot value. This will give us the value which the user has typed inside the username input element. In the same way, let's create a password variable, and to get the password, again we can say this dot password. So this password is this property. On that, we are going to use native element property, and from there we are going to get the value which the user has entered in the password field. And with this, all we are going to do is we are going to call this login method of this auth service. For that, first of all, we need to inject an instance of this auth service inside this login component. So let me create a property here. I'll call it auth service. It is going to be of type auth service. Okay, and in order to ask Angular to inject an instance of this auth service, we are going to use this inject method. And to use it, we need to import it from angular/go. And there we need to specify the type. So the type is going to be auth service. Okay, and now using this auth service instance, we are going to call the login method. So let's say this dot auth service dot login. And when we are calling this login method, we need to pass the value for username and password parameter. So for the username, let's pass the value which we have inside this username variable. And for the password parameter, let's pass the value which we have inside this password variable. Now, what this login method is going to return? This login method, it is going to return us a user object. If we have a user with a given username and password, in that case, it will return a user object. Otherwise, it will return undefined. So here, what we want is, first of all, let's store the user object which we are going to get inside a variable. Let's simply call it as user. And then we are going to check if the user is undefined. That means no user exists with the given username and password. Then we will simply show an alert message saying that the login credentials you have entered is not correct. Okay. Otherwise, if the user is not undefined, that means a user with the given user ID and password exists. In that case, we want to show another alert window saying welcome, and then we want to show the username. So for that, we can say user dot name, and we will say you are logged in. Okay. Let's quickly test this implementation. So let's go back to our application. There, if I go back to VS Code again, and if I open our user service, so here we have 4 users. We have this user with username JS and password as 12345. So for all the users, I have specified the password as 12345. But the username is different. For example, username is JS or MJ or MV or SK. So let's use any one of these username. I'm going to use JS. So let's go back to our application. Here we are in the login page. So the username is JS and password is going to be 12345. When I click on this login button, you will see that welcome John Smith, you are logged in. If I say MJ, and then when I click on this login button, it says welcome Mary Jane, you are logged in. But if I type a username or password with which we do not have any user, for example, if I say XYZ, okay, and some random password, and when I click on this login button, it says the login credentials you have entered is not correct. So it is working as expected. Now, one more thing which I want to do is, let's say I specify the proper username and password, for example, JS and password as 12345. When I click on this login button, it will show us this alert window. Welcome, John Smith, you are logged in. And when I click on this OK button, what I want is, I want to redirect the user to the courses page. Okay, so once this OK button is clicked, the user should be redirected to courses page. For that, let's go back to VS Code and let's go to login component.ts file. And there, after this alert window, let's go ahead and let's redirect the user. Now, in order to redirect the user, we need an instance of router class inside this login component. So let's create a property. Let's simply call it router. It is going to be of type router. And what we want is, we want Angular to inject an instance of this router class. And in order to use this router class, we also need to import it from Angular/router. Okay, so we have imported it from Angular/router. So in this way, we will have an instance of this router class. All we are going to do is we are going to redirect the user. So we'll say this dot router dot navigate. And where do we want to navigate the user? We want to navigate the user to courses page. So I'll simply say slash courses. Okay, let's quickly test it. So here for the username, I have entered JS, and for the password, I have entered 12345. Let me go ahead and let me click on this login button. So we should see this message, welcome John Smith, you are logged in. And when I click on this OK button, it will redirect us to the courses page. So the login functionality is implemented. Now we want to implement the logout functionality. So this logout link, it is also available in header component. So let me open header component. Let's scroll up. Let's expand this header folder. And there we have this header component.html. And there we have this logout link. So again here, instead of using href, I'm going to use router link. And the route here is again going to be login. So whenever the logout link is clicked, we want to show the view of the login component. We want to redirect the user to the login page. So here the route is going to be login. And with this route, I also want to pass some query parameter. For that, I'm going to use this query param directive. Okay, and let's wrap this query param within square brackets, because here I want to assign an object to it. And in that object, I'm going to specify this logout query parameter, and I'm going to set it to true. So if I save the changes, and if we go to the web page, here it says can't bind query param since it isn't a known property of A. Okay, that's because it should be query params and not query param. Let's go back again. And currently we are in the courses page. Now when I click on this logout, just notice what is the URL. So when I click on this logout, we are redirected to the login page, and in there we have a query string called logout. Now we are going to read this query string, the value of this logout query string. If it is true, in that case, we are going to call the logout method of this auth service. So in the auth service, let me close this header component.html. We don't need it anymore. And in the auth service, you will see we also have this logout method where we are simply setting this isLog to false. So whenever the logout query string is true, we are going to call this logout method of this auth service. Now, in which component do we need to write that logic to read the query parameter and call this logout method? We are going to do it in login component. Now, why is that? That's because, let me again open this header component.html. So when this logout link is clicked, which component are we displaying? We are displaying the view of login component, right? So it is this component where we need to read the value of this logout query parameter. So let's go to login component.ts file, and in there, the first thing which we need to do is, in order to read the query parameter value, we need an instance of activated route class. For that, I'm going to create a property. I'll call it as active route. The type here is going to be activated route. Okay, and what we want Angular to inject an instance of this activated route class inside this login component. So to this inject method, we will pass the type. All right, now let's go ahead and let's implement ng on init lifecycle hook. And in here, we will say this dot active route dot query param map. And since it is an observable, we are going to subscribe to it. And to this subscribe method, we need to pass a callback function. And this callback function will be executed every time the query parameter of the currently active route changes. Here, we are going to receive the query parameters. So let's simply call it as maybe queries. Okay. And in order to get the query value, the query parameter value on this queries, we are going to call the get method. And to this get method, we need to specify the name of the query parameter. And the name of the query parameter is logout. Now, this here, it is going to return us a string value, and we want to convert it to Boolean type. So this logout, it is going to return us true, but that true will be a string value. So we are going to convert it to Boolean type. For that, I'm using this Boolean method. Okay, and we are going to store it in a variable. And let's simply call this variable logout. And now we are going to check if this logout is true. In that case, we are going to call the logout method of this auth service, this method, and we have an instance of this auth service inside this auth service property. So here we can say this dot auth service dot logout. Okay, and once the user is logged out, we also want to show an alert message. For that, I'm going to use this alert function, and here we want to say you are now logged out. And just to check the value of this is logged property, this is logged property of this auth service, when the user has been logged out, what I'm going to do is I'm also going to log the value of the is logged. So here I'll say is logged equals, and I'll say this dot auth service dot, this auth service has this is logged property. So when the user is logged out, this is logged should be set to false. And I want to check if that is happening or not. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Okay, so let me first log in. So John Smith is logged in. Let's click on OK. It will redirect us to the courses page. Now let me click on this logout button. And it says you are now logged out and is logged has been set to false. And when I click on this OK button, it will redirect us to the login page, because in the URL you can see the route is /login, right? And for this route, we are displaying the view of login component. So in this way, we have implemented a very simple auth service for our Angular application. Now we are going to use this auth service in order to understand can activate route card and can activate child route card.